Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first live stream that I'm trying to make. Uh, Now, why go on a live stream rather than restrict myself to Google Meet? Now, there are two basic problems I was facing on Google Meet. One is that I was forced to sort of interrupt myself time and again as new students joined in. So I felt it was a better option for them to directly go to YouTube Live. And secondly, since our founder suggests that, knowledge is free, therefore I am opening up these discussions to a whole range of people who would like to be part of the discussions. Now, today, what I'm planning to do is to revisit my discussions on Sir Roger and the Addison's Coverley papers. And today I'll be discussing two issues of the Coverley papers. The first being that, what is the role of the Spectator in the Coverley papers? And secondly, what role does the Spectator Club play in the Spectator papers? Right. So let me first go on to the second question first, as to what is the importance of the Spectator Club and why does Addison, create the Spectator Club for a sequence of 555 essays. Now, as Addison points out, there were several other periodicals which were already in the operational pipeline at this point of time, most importantly being Defoe's The Review, and John Dunton's, of course, the Athenian Mercury, which had ceased publication after a brief period of time. But in all these, Addison was bringing in, a new kind of variant of news. While Defoe was promoting directly political and military news, Addison was more interested in creating a public sphere and public opinion where social, literary, and cultural issues, apart from political ones, of course, could be discussed. But his aim was to draw in the maximum potential number of people. And therefore, it was important for him not to be appearing politically lopsided. One of the words, the key words in your texts that all of you have looked at is the issue of a strict neutrality. Now, the Spectator makes it a point that his observational gaze, looking at society, as it were, is one of strict neutrality. But it was also important for Addison to incorporate into this gaze a kind of omniscience, a kind of observing through the lens, as it were, the maximum cross-section of society that was possible. Now, you must remember something. At this point of time, literacy was rising, but it was yet to rise to any sort of phenomenal level. So the primary readers of the Spectator papers would have been the upper class gentry and the upper middle class and the somewhat what Defoe called the middling class, who were literate, who were coming into the public sphere. But the people who were not included in Addison's readership were primarily the rural people, to a certain extent, the rural people in the sense the rural poor, and in many cases, the urban poor. So Addison's paper does not have the kind of inclusivity of the novel. It does not talk at length about, say, criminals, prostitutes, and so on and so forth. Its representation is restricted to certain social phenomena only. But to get this into operation, Addison also had to fall back upon certain representatives who would stand for their respective social positions. The other thing is that Addison's purpose, and this is something which all of you must repeatedly remember and look at essay number 10 repeatedly for that purpose, was to enliven morality with wit and to temper wit with morality. Now that's the maxim that he follows. And his avowed aim was to bring philosophy out of closets and libraries, to dwell among clubs and coffee houses, something which I have stressed repeatedly and which I want you to also keep at the back of your mind. Now for this, therefore, Addison needed humor. Addison needed narrative. And the best way to create a narrative on various social issues was to represent the social classes through certain figures. And that, I think, went into the genesis of the Spectator Club, as it were. Addison was, of course, also trying to reach out to a vast amount of women readers. But very curiously, and not really very curiously, because even in clubs and coffee houses at that point of time, women hardly made an entrance. Therefore, it was difficult to put a woman on board the Spectator Club. But what he could instead do is bring women characters into the essays. And if you've looked at the two essays that we have discussed, one on the perverse widow with whom Sir Roger is in love, and also Moll White, as it were, the supposed witch, who's really an old woman who's mentally deranged, but then classified as a witch. Addison is bringing in these women as part of the narrative of the Spectator papers. So why need the Spectator papers? The Spectator Club, I'm sorry. One is that Addison wants an interface between the writer of the periodical essay and his audience. So this interface is two-pronged. First, through the Spectator who narrates, and through the Spectator Club, who become part of this, retinue of the 555 essays that he's going to write. So he can create narratives around them and add the moral caveats. Therefore, bringing wit and morality together in one particular interface. That's the first point that I wanted to make. The second point is that for reaching out to the maximum amount of audience, he needs their representatives also to be on board. Therefore, the importance of incorporating the members of the Spectator Club. At the same time, it's a 555 essay series, so it's not just a matter of 10, 20 small essays. He's thinking of it in a very long term. And therefore, once the characters are there, he can wind up narratives around them and thereby allow a continuity in the Spectator Club, thereby holding on to the interest of the audience. So this, I think, is the root of the genesis of the Spectator Club, as it were. Remember that Defoe is doing the same. Steele has already done it in the Tattler, right? He's invented the character of Bickerstaff, as it were. Dunton has brought in the Athenian board in the Athenian Mercury. So Addison is not really doing something new. But what is effectively new in Addison is the range of characters which is bringing into the Spectator Club. Now let's take a careful look at them and what they mean to the essays. The first, of course, is Sir Roger de Coverley, who stands very squarely and fairly for the landed gentry. He's a landowner, right? He's also the sheriff. He's also the judge in the county. And he represents, in many ways, the country. Now, as I pointed out in my discussion on the essays, there were several kinds of frictions within society at this point of time. The landed gentry was coming into conflict with the new rising merchant class. The Whigs and the Tories had political differences. The Protestants and the Catholics had religious differences. The country and the city were coming into conflict also, right? So these frictions, Addison also has to bring into the essays. So if they're representative essays, if they are, as it were, truthful parts of the discourse of news, he cannot ignore it, right? So Roger de Coverley, very squarely and fairly, landed gentry, Tory, and part of the country, though he meets occasionally in the Spectator Club in the city. Now you have to remember this, that the Spectator Club is primarily an urban phenomenon. It meets in the London coffee houses, right? But the dispersal of the Spectator Club is also to the city, so it's, in a certain sense, pretty inclusive. So Sir Roger de Coverley, and Addison uses Sir Roger de Coverley more extensively than any of the other characters of the Spectator papers. How does he do so? Now, Addison creates Sir Roger as a slightly eccentric, paternal, generous, yet slightly pompous member of the landed gentry. In this, he was rather, he was being rather truthful. Most of the landed gentry were entitled, pompous, considered themselves all powerful. Where Sir Roger is unique is that he's extremely generous. But note one point of Addison. Sir Roger de Coverley is old. You might turn back towards me and say, so what? Most of the Spectator characters are old. Now, while that's true, you have to, the essay that we discussed, for example, Sir Roger at Home, everything about Sir Roger's household is archaic. So there's a suggestion that this landed gentry itself, the institution itself, is slightly archaic and potentially on the verge of decay. This is point number one. And since Sir Roger de Coverley is archaic and slightly eccentric, therefore he behaves in very humorous ways. For example, he cannot employ a chaplain who knows more than him, first. Secondly, he will stand up in church while a sermon is being read out to see if everybody is paying attention to it. He will sleep himself during the course of the sermon, but suddenly rise up and ask somebody who's sleeping to get up and respond properly. So these comic quirks, as it were, of Sir Roger de Coverley make him, a kind of a narrative delight, as it were, because Addison can then direct his irony, very, very mild, very moderate irony, towards the landed gentry and its mannerisms, as it were. Right. So that's the purpose of Sir Roger de Coverley. But remember that Sir Roger de Coverley is the most sustained character in the Coverley paper, in the Spectator papers. Right. He serves as a bridge to unite the continuity of the Spectator papers more than any other character of the Spectator papers. This is a point here. The second is that this continuity, which sort of holds the audience also together. The second point that I wanted to make is that Sir Roger de Coverley also allows Addison to initiate discourses about romance, discourses about superstition. So the the Spectator is Sir Roger de Coverley's guest, and therefore he can travel around the country. So the movement of the Spectator, from the country to the city, and from the city to the country, takes place with the help of Sir Roger de Coverley. Right. So that's Sir Roger de Coverley's function, as it were, within the essays. Provides the Spectator with a platform of observation. Also, Sir Roger in Love, Sir Roger's Death provides separate languages of romance and pathos for the narrative component of the Spectator papers. Now the question remains, is Sir Roger de Coverley a narrative function, merely a representative? Or is Sir Roger de Coverley more than that, a fully rounded character? Now, Sir Roger de Coverley is a representative of his class. Sir Roger de Coverley is a narrative function also. But only Sir Roger de Coverley in the Spectator papers seems to escape beyond this narrative function and become a reasonably rounded character. Let me explain. What is the narrative function of Sir Roger de Coverley? To create a continuum. But there's one more narrative function here. That Sir Roger de Coverley is an idealized version of what the country squire should be. Generous to his subjects, generous to the church, and so on and so forth. But he's also perfectly in harmony with Sir Andrew. There's a running debate, as you've seen in the death of Sir Roger. Even at this deathbed, he sends, a copy of the laws to Andrew, marking the places where they've had a dispute. Right. So, very obviously, Sir Roger de Coverley has a dispute with the merchants, but he is in harmony with them. So, this peaceful coexistence of the classes is a theme that Addison is building into the Spectator papers. You see, all these people constitute the public sphere. But Addison's public sphere is not with rank. It is without the confrontational and the violence that contemporary 18th century often saw. Rather, Addison was promoting a harmonious and a coexistent public sphere. Is Sir Roger de Coverley rounded? Yes. He is eccentric to a certain extent, but that eccentricity is given a psychological explanation. When Addison talks about his youth, his falling in love with the widow and her repeated taunts to him, as a result of which Sir Roger slightly goes batty. And finally, Sir Roger's death, where the character is, as it were, brought to a resolution. Right. Now, he's not rounded in the sense that Tom Jones is rounded or Moll Flanders is rounded. But Sir Roger de Coverley enjoys a kind of an independent existence apart from the social function of the Roger de Coverley essays. Right. His emergence as a character is independent, really, of the morality that Addison seeks to promote. Now, that is Sir Roger de Coverley. The rest of the characters, mind you, are largely functional in the sense that they are mere representatives of their class positions and their social, professions. So, class and profession. Who are these characters? Sir Andrew Freeport, who is a merchant and who says that the sea is the British common. Now, this, I think, is a representative of the East India Company merchant who considered free trade as his birthright and who was ruthlessly colonizing the globe. Now, Sir Andrew is therefore a man of great judgment, financial acumen, and that it is said in the Spectator papers, of course, that there's not a vessel or a ship that is bringing in some resources of Andrew to the nation. Now, in one of the papers, which we actually have not discussed in class, Addison talks about the stock exchange. Now, these are spaces which Addison is for the first time bringing into literary discourse. For example, in essay number 49, which I think many of you have not read, you should, Addison talks about the coffee house. Addison then proceeds to the stock exchange, which is a vibrating, chaotic place. Yet, at the same time, this chaotic space becomes also a kind of a space where the it becomes a kind of a space where the wealth of the nation is, as it were, generated. So, in that sense of the term, the coffee house is an extremely important part of the Spectator papers. So, it is in this sense that we see Addison creating numerous kinds of spaces and numerous kinds of new formations within society, which are part of the Spectator papers. Now, therefore, it is Sir Andrew who becomes both a representative of his class as well as an idealized merchant. And the fact that he is the knighted part of the Spectator papers is also important in the sense that he is seen as an integral and more important part of the city, or the part of the broader perspective of society. Now, the third character who is part of the Spectator papers, of course, is Captain Sentry, who is the inheritor of Sir Roger's estate and is also representative of the army, which is seen as a kind of the advanced, is seen as the extremely generous once again, and also Captain Sentry is seen as somebody who is part of the code of chivalry. Is again very silent in that sense of the term. So the army is quite obviously not on Addison's mind that much. The military affairs are not part of the broader rubric of the Spectator papers to that extent. It is rather culture that Addison is talking about. And similarly, you have the lawyer at the Inner Temple, who, in a very ironic way, as Addison points out, is more interested in theatre than in law. Now, that's an interesting point, isn't it? That Addison is describing, a professional person, a professional lawyer, who is rather more interested in the aspect of theatre rather than in the law. Now, that is something which I find extremely interesting, but it also points out to the priority of the Spectator papers, that the priority of the Spectator papers is not in the priority of the Spectator papers is not in the creation of a not in the creation of a military discourse, or a legal discourse. It is rather in the creation of a more in the more civilized, in a more civilized, theatrical cultural discourse. So that it is in that sense that I see that the Spectator papers is more interested in the cultural aspect of things rather than in the literary, rather than, I'm sorry, in the military aspect. So my point here is that Addison is creating a particular kind of discourse within the Spectator papers, as it were. Is creating a kind of a particular way of looking at society. So that's the element of Captain Sentry and the figure of the lawyer of the inner temple. There's of course the clergyman in the Spectator papers who speaks very little, and finally, then there is the Spectator himself, and I shall come to the Spectator in a little while. But these are the major characters in the Spectator Club. Now, what is the role of the Spectator Club here? Right. The role of the Spectator Club is, of course, to present a cross-section of society. Now, what does this cross-section not consist of? This cross-section does not consist of, I would say, the lower classes. The lower classes are, as it were, taken away. But please remember that they are taken away with a purpose. It's not that they're not present in the Spectator papers. It's just that they're not present, as it were, in the corpus of the Spectator Club. They're dispersed through the different essays of the Spectator Club. This is one. The second is that this is therefore a limited cross-section that is available. And secondly, or rather thirdly, it is an idealized cross-section in the sense that the Spectator papers represent characters who have this very closeted, very well-knit relationship amongst themselves. They are in great harmony with each other. Right? So it is in this sense, therefore, that the Spectator papers presents an idealized version of society. So to round off this discussion, let me come back to what is the role of the Spectator Club. One, that it presents a cross-section of a society, even if it is limited. The lower classes are represented in the, I would say, the more dispersed part of the essays. This is one. The second component is that the Spectator papers provides an idealized public sphere, a kind of a literary version of the public sphere where they're virtually meeting. See, this too is a virtual medium where we are supposedly meeting. And my camera having gone off, you're watching a black screen, really. I'm sorry about that. But it's similar in the sense that within the print space of the public sphere, Addison is bringing discourses of society, which are being discussed by these members amongst themselves. So Addison is not suggesting that I am writing the essays. is suggesting, look, there's a broader group of people who are meeting and discussing the Spectator, the problems of society. It's in this way that's creating a virtual version of the public sphere. Thirdly, what I wanted to suggest is that this bonhomie, this intense interaction amongst themselves, the kind of harmony that these characters represent, suggests the ideal version of civil society. Now, you have to understand, and this I've suggested in the essays, is that Addison is not only creating a public sphere, he's also creating a version of the civil society in the Spectator papers, where people can interact with each other rather than only, arguing with each other. So in this space, there is a potential for interaction, exchange, and it is all done in a very civil manner. So the Spectator papers represents a cross-section of society. It allows a narrative interface between the essayist and his audience. It creates an idealized version of of society. It projects a notion of the public sphere, and finally, it projects also a notion of civil society. It is in these ways, therefore, that the Spectator Club becomes functional within the Coverley, within Addison's Spectator papers. It is with this that I bring this discussion to a close, primarily because my camera has failed me. Now, I will, of course, come back with the discussion of the role of the Spectator today at 3 o'clock, right? So all of you are requested to join me at 3 o'clock with the discussion on the Spectator, the role of the Spectator himself. I'm sorry for the glitches that have crept up, but I think largely in my next discussion, I'll be able to get rid of them. Right, thank you for joining in the class, and reserve your questions in the Spectator Club so that I can bring them to, you can sort of put them before me in my next discussion. Right, I will end the broadcast, therefore, here now, and we'll see each other at 3 o'clock. Thank you very much